What I'd like to do now is go to part 2, which is to talk about the activities of the International Standards Organization. Some of the material in this video does overlap with some previous videos, but I'm trying to put this together as a single package. So you will find this particular material focused on ISO activities, specifically focused on automotive human factors. So ISO, the International Standards Organization, is the most important global standards organization. ISO exists to support international trade and travel, and has existed since shortly after the Second World War for specifically that purpose. ISO has an organization that's like many other standards development organizations, and I'll talk somewhat about their process. It's really, really important to understand that just as journal articles and so forth are reviewed, so ISO and other standards development organizations have a process for vetting what becomes a standard, and that assures that the quality is high. All right. So ISO is organized around a number of technical committees, and finding this information often takes a little bit of care. The process for the current website is to go to iso.org, select taking part, who developed the standards, and then technical committees. The details of that are covered in some other videos. Now, the website does change from year to year, and I just want to say that this process, this series of steps that I've outlined now, may not work in the future, but the critical item is to get to the technical committees list. All right, so ISO has something on the order of 300 technical committees. The number keeps increasing over time, and they cover a wide range of topics. So, for example, they cover issues related to road vehicles. Some of them are related to particular applications. Some are related to topics. Some are related to basic materials. And what I want to do is give you some examples, which appears here on this slide. So the original standards, technical committees 1 and 2, were really issues that were central to international trade and travel. Things like screw threads and fasteners. If you don't have international agreement on the parts that are used to make pretty much everything, then it's very difficult to ship things internationally. So therefore, screw threads and fasteners, nuts and bolts was something that was one of the first topics that were addressed. Steel and all kinds of materials. Obviously, if you're making a product, you'd like to be able to specify what it's made of, and steel is an important component in many, many products. So being able to say, I want this steel with the following qualities, you need to have some standard way to identify what that steel is. The committee that's of interest to this particular presentation is road vehicles, and that's Technical Committee 22. I'll have more to say about them later. Then there are issues about many other topics, and these are just examples: acoustics, pallets, statistical methods, because we want to do things internationally in a consistent manner. Ergonomics, I'll talk about them in another video. Intelligent transportation systems, TC204 applies to this video, as does TC159. And here's just some examples of the many, many topics that are covered. The number of parentheses indicates the number of standards that have been developed by that particular committee as of 2017. The number continues to increase. Organizationally, ISO is founded around technical committees. Depending upon the technical committee, they can have anywhere from 4 to 20 subcommittees. In ISO lingo, they're referred to as SCs. Subcommittees can have working groups anywhere from 0 to 10. So it's technical committees have subcommittees, subcommittees have working groups, and working groups have task forces, and the number can vary from 0 to 5. It might be a technical committee has only subcommittees and no working groups or task forces below it. It just depends upon the sort of scope of work that they're tasked to perform. So again, the structure is technical committees, subcommittees, working groups, task forces. The number of these is in the many, many thousands. So there's a process that ISO uses that's consistent with what many other standards development organizations use. And the focus is on evidence. And what's the data? What are the numbers? What's the material? What's the journal articles, the conference papers, the technical reports that provide the evidence that we need to develop a standard? The important qualities of ISO and others recognized standards development organizations, that's the key phrase, often referred to as SDOs, is the process has to be open. And by that I mean there's no constraints on who can participate in the process. It's not only the manufacturers and representatives of those manufacturers, it's open to the public, to universities, to anybody who has the technical qualifications to participate. These things generally take on the order of years to complete because you really need, just like vetting of journal articles, to take the time to review all the materials, to discuss them, and to reach consensus. And so again, the important point is discussion, openness, and an important difference between standards development organizations and something like the Alliance Automotive Manufacturers, where only Alliance representatives are allowed to participate. Their meetings are not open. So how does a standard come about? Well, typically within a technical committee or subcommittee, or most likely at a working group level, there's been some discussion over a period of time about ideas for a standard. And eventually, if they reach agreement as to what it needs to be, then that becomes something called a PWI, a preliminary work item. This is before it becomes official. And then it goes to a new work item, which then is like, this is an official, and there's a clock that starts on the development of the standard, and that clock has 3 years to run. And if a new work item does not become a standard in 3 years, it's abandoned. Now, as part of that process, you need people to work on the development of that standard, and typically a task force is formed for that purpose, and usually there's around 5 people or so who are representing various countries, generally 1 or 2 people from each country, who are most interested in seeing that new work item become some kind of standard or report or official ISO document. So then that task force will meet face-to-face 2 to 3 times per year in some country, which will vary from time to time. They will also exchange emails between meetings. But really most of the real work happens during the meeting when they work face-to-face. And of course, as they're doing this work, they're pushing the information up the chain of command, so they're going to working groups and subcommittees to tell them what they're doing. And the important point here is they're trying to build consensus. So standards aren't passed normally because it's a majority vote, but rather there's a consensus of people on the technical committee, the subcommittee, the working group, and the task force that something that's in the standard is appropriate. Eventually, it reaches the point of becoming a draft international standard. And there's a whole process of going from subcommittees to working groups and back up the chain of command, vice versa, to ask for changes. So a task force will develop something. There'll be consensus on the task force that it's appropriate. They'll pass it along to a working group. A working group might discuss it further. Then the working group might pass it up to the subcommittee. The subcommittees will have comments on the draft. They'll pass it back to the working group. So there's a lot of back and forth between these groups to reach consensus. Eventually, it's balloted by the task force, the subcommittee, and finally the technical committee. And again, I want to emphasize that this process is consensus-based. It's not just a majority. So even if you have a majority, but you don't have consensus among the members, then it's not likely to move forward. Finally, if it's approved at the technical committee level, it goes to a final draft international standard. It goes to the ISO Secretariat in Geneva. They do format checks. It then becomes a standard that is published. And again, I want to emphasize that this process has a 3-year clock. So if a new work item doesn't make it through in 3 years, then it's dropped as an item. So that means when it's a preliminary item, there can be discussion over many years before there's agreement that something is sort of well-defined enough that it's going to move forward as a standard. And this is really intended so that items don't hang around forever, that once it becomes part of the official process, then there needs to be active engagement in getting it either voted upon and approved or dropped. Now, what I want to emphasize is that I've described the process for ISO, but many other standards development organizations have a lot of the same elements in their standard development process. And this is important to getting these documents accepted and recognized. So there needs to be this concept of openness, that you cannot constrain membership in the organization. Now, in the case of ISO, in order to join, there is a fee. And there's a fee to the National Standards Organization, there's a fee for every technical committee that one belongs to. But it's really important to have this openness. As part of this openness, the process is open. So when ISO does something, there's an announcement of committee meetings. There are opportunities for people to comment. Now, within some of these organizations, to be honest, it's really the matter of who's on the committee and who's involved. But there's still efforts to make sure that there are opportunities for those that are interested to be able to get some information on what's occurring and to be able to provide comments. It's really important that the members be qualified. And you really want people that are technical experts, that really know the subject matter. So in most of these technical committees, subcommittees, and so forth, people need to present resumes, and their resumes are reviewed before people are allowed to join. Now, I should comment that it's pretty rare for somebody to be rejected, but I think it's because the pool of applicants is such that people usually do have some level of expertise that's appropriate. These people, in theory, are volunteers, but what one finds in ISO is often they work for a particular company and their time is funded by their employer. This is challenging for academic members because it's difficult for them to get funding for both their time and travel that's required to participate effectively within ISO or any other standards development organization. Again, consensus is important. It's not majority rules. It's getting basically agreement of just about everybody. That often, you're still going to have somebody sometimes that will not agree. But you want to do your best to at least recognize their comments and accept as many of them as possible. Also, a key point, again, to emphasize is this hierarchical organization of ISO. Other organizations are likewise, American National Standards Institute and others have a similar structure. This process is slow. It does take years to develop some sort of standard, but that's because they only meet a few times a year. They exchange things by email, but a lot of the important interactions happen face-to-face. In other organizations, sometimes like ANSI, that may or may not be the case, but it just takes time to really think things through. A key point is evidence. You want to have the data to support the standard. Now, it's not always the case that it's there, but the extent to which you can find journal articles, conference papers, technical reports that provide data to support the development of a particular standard and the technical requirements within that standard, the stronger the standard is going to be, and the more likely it's going to be expeditiously approved. And finally, there's a huge problem, which is cost. Standards generally are not available for free, and so therefore one has to pay a fee for it. And it's typically at least $1 a page, and some ISO standards are $4 or $5 per page, and they are copyright protected. So you cannot go online and get them and even look at the full standard. You can only look at part of the standard. This is because the way ISO and other standards development organizations are funded is from fees that are associated with the sales of standards. There are other mechanisms by which they get funding, but if these fees didn't exist, then support for getting the standards done, for the staff work, for printing, publication, and all the activities that are associated with it, if there's no coverage for those things, then the standards just don't exist. So sadly, they are not available for free, most of them. The costs are not cheap, but that's the only mechanism by which they're financially viable. And the last point I wanted to make, and this is an important one, is those in academia are often unaware of applicable standards. Because they're publishing more on the science than the application, often even within engineering, people often don't know about the standards that are applicable to their research. That is a huge problem. And it's in part reflected in the fact that if you look at standards committees, especially when you look at American academicians, those committees generally do not have much representation on them from the United States, from academic organizations. They can't get the funding, and they may not see the importance to their research. In fact, it is very important that the work that they do sees application, and one way that happens is through standards. So let me now focus on ISO standard, or ISO Technical Committee 22, which is road vehicles, the focus of this particular presentation. All right, so what are road vehicles? They are cars, trucks, buses, SUVs, minivans, motorcycles. Typically, sometimes people use the word light vehicles and heavy vehicles, depending upon their gross weight. But this is what ISO Technical Committee 22 is concerned with. But they're not concerned with other kinds of vehicles. So they're not concerned with construction equipment, agricultural equipment, mining, military vehicles, off-road vehicles, the kinds of vehicles that are shown here. They are dealt with by other technical committees. And I should comment that this does create some challenges, because there may be things that are developed in the way of standards for road vehicles that are applicable to other types of vehicles as well. So there are liaisons between the various technical committees to help make that happen, but it doesn't always occur. All right, so how are organizations, people, and so forth represented within ISO? How does it all work together? So again, I mentioned that there are technical committees, subcommittees, working groups, and so forth. And in order to be involved in these activities, then the National Standards Organization or professional society needs to pay a fee to ISO to participate. There are two levels of participation. Observers, who get only the documents, and P members, participants, who can actually vote. And so the people that want to vote are the ones that have the most interest in the particular standard. And again, because they're paying, the fee to participate is greater than the fee to observe, because the participants have more impact. So then the question is, who would be interested, in which countries would be interested in road vehicles and therefore want to belong to Technical Committee 22, and in particular as participants? Well, here's the full list as of right now of who belongs to ISO Technical Committee 22. And the countries that belong are the countries that either have lots of vehicles or they produce vehicles because they want to have some influence over the requirements for their design and evaluation. The Secretariat is AFNOR, which is the French Standards Organization. So they lead the people from AFNOR, lead the Technical Committee 22 meetings. They circulate the documents. They send somebody to every meeting to take notes and sort of organize events. That's their role. So that's an important role, but it means some resources have to be allocated by them to support these activities. And here you can see the countries that belong to Technical Committee 22. Again, these are the larger countries and the countries that are more involved in vehicle production. In addition, here's the list of observers. So the list of observers is much larger. They really need to know what's happening, but for them, for example, Cameroon, there's not much automotive production in Cameroon, so they're less concerned about it, but they still need to know what's going on, and so hence it's important for them to be an observer, not a participant. The participants are the ones who vote. Now, within every technical committee, there are a large number of subcommittees. And the subcommittee that's of interest is Subcommittee 39. It's sort of an artifact of history that that the number is 39. It doesn't mean there are 39 committees. There were originally, I believe, 13 or 14 committees. Then they restructured, so the committees from 1 through 14 were dropped, or 1 through 13, whatever the number was. And they renumbered the committees and restructured them with higher level numbers. So you can see the committees run from 31 through 41. The committee that's of greatest interest to this presentation is Technical Committee 22, Subcommittee 39, which is ergonomics. In addition to the subcommittees I just mentioned, there's coordination with all kinds of other committees, and so here's some technical committees and subcommittees and working groups that they interact with. So for example, tire noise testing, well, that's appropriate for the people in motor vehicles to know about, but also the people who are interested in tires and the people who are interested in noise. They all need to kind of get their act together and coordinate writing standards that are appropriate for that. So there are various joint technical committees for that purpose. So yes, noise and other topics that are of interest to joint committees, so there are joint subcommittees to coordinate those things. So, Technical Committee 22, Subcommittee 39 is ergonomics. What do they do? So, again, as you can participate in a technical committee, you also have people who can be P&O, meaning participant and observers, in subcommittees. So these are really the primary vehicle producers, and the ones that are in bold are the ones that are sort of contributing the most to Subcommittee 39. And so again, these are the major vehicle producers: Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, the Netherlands, Sweden, UK, and US. So you can be a P member, but the number of delegates that you send to a meeting, the level of effort that you provide can vary between members. These are the most active ones. Here's observers, and again, just like you can be an observer to a technical committee, if you're interested in a sub-area, then you have to pay an additional fee to be a member of a subcommittee. And here's the ergonomics, road vehicle ergonomics subcommittee members. So again, these are the ones that are most interested in that topic. All right, Subcommittee 39 has 4 working groups. Here they are, and again, they're not, there's some numbers that were skipped for some historical reasons. Let me describe what they do. So where are controls and displays? Telltales is their technical word for warnings. Where are they found? Working Group 5 is very active. They update their standard every year. Symbols. 7, R and H point, which is a reference point in the vehicle for human positioning, and the positioning of mannequins or dummies that are used to determine various locations inside the vehicle. And finally, it has to do with information systems on board a vehicle. So Subcommittee 39 meets twice a year. Who goes? And how does it all happen? So typically what happens in a subcommittee meeting is before the main subcommittee meeting, there are a number of working group meetings. And so there are various topics that are addressed, and they might take a half day to meet, and there might be sometimes parallel working groups, sometimes not, but they'll meet for a half day. And then finally they get together, all the working groups, as a subcommittee. And in fact, sometimes subcommittees and working groups will have task forces, which are subsets of people, just because it's a lot easier to sometimes get things done to develop preliminary items when there are only 3 or 4 or 5 people in the room, not when there are 10 or 20. And the people who belong to these are generally sort of an active bunch of delegates who go to all these meetings. Where do they occur? Well, the intent within ISO is to balance cost. But if you look at the members of ISO, the greatest level of involvement is for European countries. So there's this tendency to have meetings in Europe and in cities like Paris, London, Munich, Turin, and the decision about where to go is made by the members of the technical committee, subcommittee, working group, whoever is involved with attending. And they need a host, so that means the host needs to provide meeting space. They may be asked to provide food, secretarial support, and other resources. And usually the goal is to find a city where there's a major airport and transportation in and out is relatively straightforward. So if they pick some small, obscure location, then all the members who are sending delegates have the problem of rather large airfare costs. So they're trying to minimize the cost to those that are attending. So they're going to look at hotel prices, food, and they're also going to consider airfare. So as a consequence of this process, it's much less likely that meetings in Asia, in Japan, Australia, and so forth are less common because it means more travel for the aggregate group of delegates. However, in the sake of fairness, there will occasionally be meetings there because it's not appropriate that the delegates from Asia should bear a larger share of the cost of travel. So, what does it take to do this? And one of the reasons why participation is not so great is because of the costs involved. And so let me just give you a sense. So let's just look not at the cost of the person, but just the cost of the meeting itself. All right. So imagine a person has to go to this meeting and they have to fly there. And if it's outside, for example, for an American outside the U.S., you're talking about an international flight. Let's say it's $800, $1,000. I'm not sure what current airfares are. There's going to be costs of ground transportation to go from the airport to wherever and to travel around the site, and you might spend another $100 or so. People are going to stay in a hotel. They're not looking for luxury hotels, but often you're in an urban setting and you're talking about $150 or $200 a night for a hotel. And then finally you need to worry about food and maybe $50, $75 a day, depending upon the location, the per diem, whether breakfast and lunch is supplied by the site, who's the host, and so forth. But it's not unusual for this total to be $2,000 or $3,000. And if you're asking people to make 2 trips a year, you're now talking about anywhere from $2,000 to $6,000 in travel costs. But the real costs are their time. And if somebody's making $1,500 or $1,000 a day in their burden rate, you're now starting to talk about a number that might be $5,000, $6,000, $7,000, $8,000, $10,000 a year easily. And that's a huge cost on their employer. All right, so, and in fact, it's that reason one of the reasons that why you don't see heavy academic involvement, because the question is who's going to pay for all their time and the travel costs. Now, as I mentioned, there's this issue of liaisons, and for Subcommittee 39, there are a number of liaisons that I need to mention. So, because Technical Committee 22 is concerned with road vehicles, then they need to coordinate with Technical Committee 23, which is machinery for agriculture. They also need to consider earth moving, and of course we have lots of symbols, so they need to talk to TC 145, that's the overarching committee involved with symbols. In addition, they also have to talk to Technical Committee 159, which is ergonomics. Obviously that pertains to the ergonomics of road vehicles. And here are some of the subcommittees of Technical Committee 159 that they need to interact with. And finally, they need to interact with Technical Committee 204, which is Intelligent Transportation Systems. And this particular committee is not as much concerned with ergonomics as they are concerned with the technology that makes things work. So let me talk a little bit more about Technical Committee 204. The most important one is Working Group 14. Here's some examples of some of those committees. They're concerned with various things related to intelligent vehicle technology. The 3 subcommittees that are most important are Traveler Information Systems, Navigation System, and systems having to do with warnings. But there are others as well that are of importance and they need to know about. So this issue of coordination is a huge problem for many technical committees because there are many problems that span various technical committees, and getting them to work together is difficult, not because they don't want to work together, but just because the problems are so complex, and it's difficult to get people to attend all of the meetings. And so therefore the role of liaisons in doing coordination is really important and underappreciated. So how do these organizations operate? And as I've described in other videos, and I want to emphasize here, the activities in many ways sort of look like the UN if you ever watched a UN session. That consensus and getting people to work together is a challenge, it's difficult, but ultimately progress is made when there's consensus. And people will have differing opinions for different reasons. Fortunately, these technical committees tend to be less political than the UN is, but sometimes there are political issues that arise. To make the process work, generally ISO meetings are in English, but sometimes things are in French. French is the second official language. And the farther up you go with the chain of command, the more there was formality and less it's a bunch of people sitting around a table trying to work it out, and the more it becomes like the UN with all the formalities of who's speaking and in what order and how documents are introduced and so forth. The decision process changes as the level changes. At the task force level, it's just the experts talking. As soon as you get to working groups, and especially at the technical committee level, then like I said, it becomes more political, and each country receives under only one vote. And you'll see phrases or discussions like, all right, we now have this item on the floor, we have this proposal for this balloted item, who approves it, and specifically they'll do a roll call. All right, how does the German delegation vote? So you see that formality is much more at the higher level. At the lower level, it's let's talk about this. Okay, how do we feel about it? Should we approve it or not? Meetings are very formally organized. Even at the lower levels, there's always an agenda. There's somebody who's the convener there that's a technical lead. Either they or an assistant is responsible for taking notes. There are meeting notes that are published and distributed. At the higher levels, it's not as much a volunteer activity as somebody will have a formal official position as the secretariat, and this person is not they're not a technical expert on the committee, but they may become an expert over time, or rather it's a staff person who's responsible for keeping the meeting organized. Delegations, especially at the high level, have leaders, and so not everybody can talk. It's often just a delegation leader who can bring forward information from the delegation. So again, the higher up it gets, the more it looks like the UN. And finally, the important part is in between meetings, documents need to be circulated. Generally, there's not a lot of discussion, depending on the technical committee. Between meetings, they try and do as much of the formal discussion face-to-face, because you really want to get a sense of how other people feel about things, and that may not be effectively communicated in email. So for those of you who may in the future be interested in participating in ISO activities and other standards development organization activities of SAE, my suggestion is you read the publications shown here, Robert's Rules of Order. And there's sort of the official rules, and then if you want the shorthand, you can read Robert's Rules for Dummies, and there are other versions on the web out there and so forth. But you really need to understand parliamentary procedure, how motions are made, how motions are amended, and so forth. If you don't really know this, then you're at a huge disadvantage in moving things along. So at the working group and task force level, this is not of much concern. At the technical committee, they really try to follow Robert's rules. Right. So one of the challenges is you're not involved with the technical advisory committees. You're not really kind of a member of the ISO committee or other committees. It's really difficult to find out what's going on. Yes, there's some information on the web, but it's woefully incomplete. So the people who really know what's going on are those who belong to these various committees. Now, how can you find out about something if you're not on the committee? Well, you can try to find out from your delegate, from your representative, so who runs your delegation, from them what's the working group that's relevant to some question that you have, and you might email them, phone number, but if that doesn't work, then just try LinkedIn. But it's often not easy to get things. If you know the standards organization or society, sometimes you can talk to their members and find out what's going on. If that's unsatisfactory, then you can actually join the technical advisory group to the ISO committee that's involved. So for example, for ergonomics of road vehicles, much of the technical advisory group is done by various committees of the Society of Automotive Engineers. So if you join the SAE committee that's relevant, you become connected to the technical advisory committee and you get briefings and feedback on what's happening. So within, as I've indicated here, for SAE Technical Committee 22, subcommittee should say 39, Road Vehicle Ergonomics, the relevant committee is the SAE Safety and Human Factors Steering Committee. But again, to be involved, you must be a technical expert, and you have to participate in meetings. So you can't join the committee and then not go. In fact, if you miss 2 meetings in a row and you're not excused for some reason, then you're removed from the committee, because they want people who are on the committees to be actively engaged. If your country does not have P or O representation, then all you can do is contact the convener and look at the ISO website for that information. But you won't get email addresses sometimes, you won't get phone numbers, so you're going to have to look hard, maybe through LinkedIn, to try and find out who that person is. You might have success by going through their standards, their national standards organization. So what are some of the standards within ISO Technical Committee 22, Subcommittee 39, Working Group 8, which is of particular interest to this topic? And here's some examples of some of them, and I just want to talk about them very briefly. I put in the number page to give you a sense of it. So there are technical reports. TS is the trial standard. Here's an official standard, so this is dialogue management. I should comment that the year that's listed is the year that it was last updated. Or I shouldn't say updated. Updated is actually the correct term, but it may not reflect the currency. So this really is often just the date at which it was last reviewed. And these are done at multi-year cycles. In many standards organizations, it's once every 5 years. So since the last review, so it was reviewed in 2017, it doesn't mean that any changes were made or anything was done to update it. It was reviewed in 2017 and re-released. However, it could be actually a version that's several years prior to that. Information on auditory. The visual behavior one it has 2 pieces to it. It talks about some terms that are used and also how you measure visual behavior. Here's some others on legibility. There's a literature review on warnings, but notice it's from 2005. 2005 is still okay for the basic ideas, but there's been a lot done. There's a method for assessing distraction. Message priority is one that often comes up and people don't realize it exists. So, the alternative is, or the issue is, you're going to display 2 or 3 messages. How do you decide which one should be presented in which order? And trial standard 16951 deals with that. Detection and response time task is kind of an interesting assessment method for looking at cognitive load. There's this lane change task, 26022, which has been out there for a while to assess distraction. It's getting used a lot less often than it used to be. Here's some other standards. One that changes virtually every year is ISO 2575. It shows that the latest year is 2010, but in fact, almost every year there are amendments to it. And there are a number of other topics that are covered here. You can see there's some that are not related strictly to passenger cars, but other topics as well. So there are quite a few standards, and it just takes time to really read through them all and understand what's appropriate.